couple of seconds to kick in, and we'll be good to go. Thanks for your patience, everyone.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the War Industry Resistors Network webinar. We do one just about every month, and this evening's webinar is on peace in Ukraine, something that all of us have had on our mind a lot recently, I think. And we have three great presenters. I'll read their bios to you once we get started. Medea Benjamin will be with us, but in a pre-recorded video. She unfortunately managed to double book herself, and right now she's on an airplane. So we will have Medea, but she won't be here for the Q&A. But we also have Nicholas J.S. Davies, who is her collaborator in writing, and Dan Kovalik. So it'll be a great session. So to get us started, I'd like to have my colleague and friend from WERN, Paul Shannon, tell us a little bit about the War Industry Resistors Network.
Thank you, Ken, and welcome, everyone. The War Industry Resistors Network is quite an exciting network of groups across the United States, and actually a few in Canada, who are focused on one or another of the major military contractors, whether it's Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, Lockheed. All across the country, smaller groups usually, sometimes bigger groups, are focused on one or more of these corporations and the policies that they are promoting and the impact that they're having on our foreign policy, and of course the money they're making by having the world as in turmoil as it is. And so if you belong to one of these groups, or if you're interested in getting together a local organization to work on your local war contractor, we urge you to join us. I'm putting a few links in the chat right now. And the first link is to our website. Has all kinds of interesting resources, and including incredible webinars that we've done in the past, looking at the different links between war industries and different institutions in our society, showing the tremendous ability that these companies have to make U.S. policy and to benefit from it. So I'd encourage you at some point to look at that website and to especially look at those previous webinars. The next event we're coming up, it's not a webinar, but it's a workshop called Tracing the State and Local Subsidies Behind Our Hometown Military Contractors. Tracing the state and local subsidies behind your hometown military contractors. That's going to be on February 22nd at 8 o'clock. The link is there. We don't expect that to be a huge webinar, but it's interesting the ability that these war industries have to get concessions from local and state governments. And that'll be quite an interesting workshop with Taylor Barnes and Pat Garafalo. And then on March 22nd, which is the last link there that I put in, we have a webinar, a big one, Nuclear Weapons Today. And that Nuclear Weapons Today webinar will be on March 22nd, again at 8 o'clock. And that will be Jay Coughlin and Ralph Hutchison to talk about not just the TPNW, but also the U.S. nuclear posture and how dangerous that is. Be good to compare our nuclear posture with that of Russia, for instance, but also how these companies are involved in the production and the lobbying for nuclear weapons. So I think I just want to encourage people to look at that. In terms of tonight's topic, I'm just going to put, I don't know if people can see it. This is a headline from the New York Times in June 1997, talking about how our arms makers see a bonanza in NATO expansion and how they have organized themselves in 1997 when the issue was Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, whether they would be admitted to NATO. By pushing this policy and using their tremendous clout, to, that's a front page article in the New York Times. Obviously, there's a relationship to what they did then, what they're doing now, and the fact that we have a war in Ukraine. The expansion of NATO, whatever people think of the war, I think everyone has to admit that the expansion in NATO has been had a tremendous impact on whether or not Russia invaded Ukraine. And so these characters that we're dealing with, and we have to figure out a way to mobilize against the power that these companies have in the directions they're leading our country in. And we hope that the War Industry Resistance Network can be a piece of that effort. And so I would welcome all of you to get involved with us. Ken, I think we should begin our webinar.
All right, great, Paul, thanks. I just noticed that my internet is unstable and I may break up. And if that happens, somebody let me know and I'll pass it off to either Paul or Brian to take over. I'm going to read the bios of our presenters and then we'll get right into it. So most of us probably know Medea Benjamin or know of her or seen her. She's co-founder of Code Pink and the Fair Trade Advocacy Group Global Exchange. She's the author of Drone Warfare, Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection, and Inside Iran. In 2012, she was awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation's Peace Prize. She's also a recipient of the 2014 Gandhi Peace Award and the 2010 Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Prize from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Nicholas J.S. Davies is the author of Blood on Our Hands, The American Invasion and Destruction of Iraq. He has written extensively for Huffington Post, Alternate, Consortium News, Common Dreams, Salon, The Progressive, and Foreign Policy in Focus. Dan Kovalik teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He has written extensively on the issue of international human rights and U.S. foreign policy and has lectured throughout the world on these subjects. He's the author of several books, including his most recent, Nicaragua, A History of U.S. Interventions and Resistance. He recently addressed the UN Security Council on the conflict in Ukraine. So welcome all, welcome to our presenters. And Brian, if you can start us up on Medea's video, we'll begin with her.
Absolutely, just 1 second.
Hello, thank you so much for the opportunity to join what I consider to be a very important gathering to discuss who is benefiting from this war in Ukraine. It certainly isn't the Ukrainian people who are suffering so much. It's not the Ukrainian soldiers or the Russian soldiers who are dying every day. It's not the people of Russia or the people of Europe or the US or people anywhere around the world. It's really a small group of companies. A large part of that is the weapons industry, and I'm going to leave that to my colleagues to discuss. I want to focus on the energy companies. I think the American people know very little about how much those companies are profiteering from this war. It was in the beginning of this war that the US and the European countries imposed tremendous sanctions on Russian energy. Europe had been very dependent on relatively cheap Russian energy and then had to scramble to replace that. Well, who jumped into the fray to replace it? You got it, US companies. Let's first look at the oil companies. In 2022 alone, total US oil shipments to Europe increased about 70%. Bloomberg News declared in May of last year, the US is shipping the largest amount of crude oil to Europe since Washington ended its ban on exports more than 6 years ago, as buyers seek alternatives to Russian supplies. They predicted that in 2023, quote, flow volumes to Europe should continue to grow. Corporate profits have gone through the roof. ExxonMobil posted a $56 billion net profit in 2022. You know how much that amounts to per hour? $6.3 million. It wasn't only a company record, but a record for the entire Western oil industry. Another company that had record profits, Shell, with profits going to $40 billion, more than double its 2021 earnings and representing its highest earnings ever. Moving on from oil, let's look at liquid natural gas, or LNG. U.S. LNG exporters to Europe grew by more than 130% in 2022, supplying more than half of Europe's imported LNG after imports of Russian gas plummeted. In 2022, the U.S. became the largest worldwide exporter of LNG, with figures showing record profits of about $50 billion and exports predicted to rise even further in 2023. Unlike the oil companies whose names are common to us, these LNG companies are not household names. The largest one is Cheniere. According to Business Insiders, these companies like Cheniere can make about $200 million on one shipment. Quote, companies can fill a large ship, send it across the Atlantic for about $60 million, and then fetch about $275 million in the European market. Meanwhile, European gas prices have risen 200% over last year, and the US companies are selling their gas at 4 times the price that US consumers pay. This has generated tremendous hardship for European families. It's generated protest around Europe against the high costs of energy and the high cost of living. And it's generated resentment towards the United States for our companies profiteering from this crisis. Even French President Emmanuel Macron has complained. Quote, in today's geopolitical context, he said, among countries that support Ukraine, there are 2 categories being created in the gas market. Those who are paying dearly and those who are selling at very high prices. The United States, he said, is a producer of cheap gas that they are selling to us at a high price. I don't think that's very friendly. Not only is it unfriendly, it's devastating for the climate. U.S. gas is produced almost entirely by fracking. The European NGO Food and Water Action released a report saying that in terms of CO2 emissions, the imports of U.S. LNG are the equivalent to 100 coal plants. And the effect is the effect on the environment we can see in poor countries like Pakistan that are struggling to compete with the high prices that Europe can pay, leaving them to rely on dirtier fuels to meet their power demands. Reuters reported that markets like Pakistan and Bangladesh will shift towards increased use of fuel oil, coal, and other high-emission fuels during prolonged LNG price spikes. There have been calls to levy windfall profit taxes on these companies. In the US, they have been only talks but no action, whereas the European Union has tried to impose a tax on these companies, but they are suing the European Union, arguing that such taxes exceed their legal authority. I also want to mention the environmental devastation that this is causing here in the United States. I was recently traveling on the Gulf Coast in Texas to give talks about Ukraine, and I met with organizations that are on the front lines trying to stop the expansion of oil and gas production and refining in their communities that have been so devastating for their environments. And what they have told me is that in the last year, it has become so much harder for them to fight against the oil and gas companies, because these companies are now saying that the new licenses they have been granted by the US government are to help our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. Well, we have to help our brothers and sisters in Ukraine and the Gulf Coast of the United States and all over by stopping this war. Unfortunately, many of the environmental groups, the big ones, have not joined us in the call to end the war. In fact, they have been joining in the call to stand with Ukraine, to sanction the European energy, and hoping that this would lead to a quick transition to greener energy. But as we've seen, it's just led to more dirty energy being used and more profits from the dirty energy companies. So we have a job to do to work with our brothers and sisters in these environmental groups to bring them on board. And towards that end, we at Peace in Ukraine and Code Pink have created a petition that we are trying to get environmental groups to sign as well as individuals. You can find that petition on the Code Pink website, codepink.org/Biden Ukraine. Please join us on calling on Biden to recognize the environmental devastation this war is causing, recognizing the obscene windfall profits that the energy companies are making, and push the Ukrainians, particularly Zelensky, to move this from the battlefield where there is no winning in this war to the peace table where we all can benefit. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk to you today. Bye-bye.
Okay, well, I was really happy to hear Medea talk about the connection to the environmental damage and the profits being made by the fossil fuel companies. Not a lot of people are talking about that, and it's important. And more, a lot of us are making the connection from war to the issue of climate change, climate disaster. So that's good that she was able to focus on that. And if you don't know, I neglected to say that Medea and Nicholas have a book called War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. And it's well worth the read. You can get it at Code Pink or probably any publisher. And with that said, so now let me introduce Nicholas J.S. Davies.
Thank you for having me tonight. And I hope what I'm going to talk about will be interesting and helpful to you all. When the Senate Armed Services Committee began debating this year's NDAA in October, they did something quite extraordinary. Hello? Can you hear me? Are you hearing me?
We hear you fine.
Yep. Okay. All right. Okay. So yes, the Senate Armed Services Committee did something pretty extraordinary that I think a lot of people don't even know about. I'm not sure if all the people in Congress who voted for this had much idea what they were voting for. Here was the problem they were trying to solve, which is that, most of us may know that Congress has now, by, January 2023, approved military aid to Ukraine totaling $67 billion, plus another 46 of non-military aid, economic aid, and so on. But at that point, as the NDAA was coming up, it wasn't quite as much as that. It was more like about 20 billion at that point in the military aid. But from the point of view of the weapons companies, there was a little bit of a problem because, $12.5 billion of that aid was actually weapons from US stockpiles, a lot of it a lot of it weapons that were no longer being produced in the US, or even weapons that the US military was no longer using. And so for that 12.5 billion that was appropriated, that had so far only led to 1.5 billion in new weapons contracts for the merchants of death. Congress had also appropriated $6 billion in actual purchases of weapons to send to Ukraine. But at that moment, only $1.2 billion had actually been awarded in those contracts. So in fact, the situation they were looking at was one in which this war that was supposed to be a huge bonanza for the weapons companies had so far only produced $2.7 billion in new contracts for them. So, well, Senators Reid and Inhofe knew just what to do about that. And so they introduced a substitute amendment that essentially simply wiped out the previous NDAA passed by the House and substituted a completely new bill. And while this was all, of course, justified by the war in Ukraine, or that was the pretext, in fact, what they appropriated had very little to do with what had actually been sent to Ukraine. A lot of the weapons were the same, but the quantities involved were, in fact, of a completely different order of magnitude. And so Medea and I wrote an article about this on November the 14th, and we titled it, "The Reid-Inhofe Amendment Would Open the Floodgates for War Profiteers." And as it happens, it completely sailed through Congress without a peep. As I say, I think most of the people voting had no idea what they were voting for. But just to run down some of what was appropriated here. I'm sure you've all heard of the HIMARS, these whiz-bang multiple rocket launchers that have been very much in the news as sort of the saviors of Ukraine. In fact, of course, these HIMARS rockets are, incredibly destructive, and in fact, these are the same weapons that the U.S. Marines used to wreak some of the destruction that any of you will have seen if you ever looked at pictures of Mosul at the end of its months-long bombardment by the United States, the second largest city in Iraq, largely reduced to rubble in 2016 and 17. And so, the U.S. Marines built this base right outside the city that they called Rocket City. And they just fired thousands, tens of thousands of these rockets into Mosul, killing thousands of civilians. The Patrick Coburn reported after speaking to the former foreign minister that who was from Kurdistan, the Kurdish Peshmerga intelligence estimates were that at least 40,000 civilians were killed in the bombing and bombardment of Mosul. Now, but when it comes to Ukraine, at that point, only 38 of these HIMARS, these are truck-mounted multiple rocket launchers, and only 38 of them had actually been approved to be sent to Ukraine. And in fact, I believe at that point, only about half of them had actually arrived. Some may have been also destroyed by the Russians, like an awful lot of the equipment that the US has been sending over there. What did the NDAA do to replenish the US stocks, these 38 rocket systems sent to Ukraine? Well, Reed and Inhofe figured a good amount to reorder would be 700 of them. And so that's what they ordered. Plus so that's 700 truck-mounted rocket systems with 100,000 rockets. Total cost about $4 billion. Another artillery weapon that's been sent to Ukraine is the M777 howitzer. It's a 155 millimeter howitzer. It's one of the larger artillery pieces that the US, well, we could say produces. In fact, it's BEA Systems, which is actually a British company, but with manufacturing plants in various parts of the United States too. And so I'm not sure exactly where all these howitzers are made, but yeah, so the US provided 142 of these M777s to Ukraine, and the NDA, the substitute amendment to the NDAA, called for reordering 1,000 of them. That comes to a total of about $3.7 billion. And of the other weapons that have been sent to Ukraine, because not all of these have, one of the first things that the US sent was the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. And so the US sent 1,400 of the Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine. And in fact, Congress had already, this is one of the ones that had already been replaced. So Congress had already spent $340 million to actually replace those 1,400 with 2,800 Stinger missiles. On the other hand, the new contracts to be awarded from this NDAA are for 20,000 Stingers. So yeah, we sent them 1,400, have already more than double replaced that, and now we're ordering another 20,000. Harpoon anti-ship missiles, which are in the US, the US stocks are being replaced now with a newer missile. And in fact, the US has only sent 2 of these Harpoon anti-ship missiles to Ukraine. But the NDAA includes an order to Boeing for 1,000 Harpoon missiles to replace the 2 that we've sent to Ukraine. Plus, while we're at it, let's buy some of the new ones too. So there are 800 of the Kongsberg naval strike missiles. So between the 1,000 Harpoons and the 800 Kongsbergs, we're talking again at another over $3 billion. Now, there are some other weapons there that we haven't even sent to Ukraine. Those HIMARS rocket systems can also fire Lockheed Martin's long-range MGM-140 ATACMS missiles. In fact, that may be what they have. I know they've approved some longer-range missiles now, so that these may be the ones. These can travel up to 190 miles. And in fact, the US military has only ever used 560 of them, and that was in Iraq in 2003. And they, in the US inventory, are now being replaced because if you remember, under the INF treaty, the medium range missiles were prohibited in Europe. And so, in fact, these ATACMS are being phased out to be replaced with the longer range missiles that the US can now deploy since it withdrew from the INF treaty. However, while the US has only ever used 560 of those missiles, the NDAA is soliciting bids to make 6,000 of them. That's, you can figure it out, 10 times more than the US has ever even used. So, I mean, what we really have to ask, what is this all about? What are these huge stockpiles of weapons for? And many of these weapons, including the ATACMS, the Harpoons, and the Stingers, are all weapons that the Pentagon was phasing out. So why spend billions of dollars to buy thousands of them now? What is this really all about? Is this just we all tend to say, oh, well, this is all just gravy for the weapons companies. This is all just to pad their profits. But there's something else going on here. There's a rationale behind this. And in the article about this that we quoted, this is an article in, I think it's Military Times, and they asked a guy called Mark Kansian, who some of you may have come across before. He's a retired Marine colonel who works at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was also a senior official at the Office of Management and Budget for 7 years. So what Kansian said is these numbers are much larger, obviously, than just replenishing stocks. These are huge numbers. They are not driven by what we've given to Ukraine, but they are sort of related to what we've given to Ukraine. He said this isn't replacing what we've given them. It's building stockpiles for a major ground war in Europe in the future. This, and as he says, this is not the list you would use for China. For China, we'd have a very different list, he said. And I suspect that we could be looking at the 2024 NDA and searching for what that list might look like. In addition to all this, there's 30,000 Hellfire missiles, 36,000 AGM-179 air-to-ground missiles, and then we come to the Patriot systems, which of course they're now sending Ukraine, and so yes, the Inhofe-Reid wish list included 10,000 Patriot missiles plus launchers, which could, that could all add up to tens of billions of dollars. So this is all pretty dangerous. What are they doing here? And the consensus seemed to be amongst the military analysts that, this is all, as somebody was saying before, to do with NATO. And the idea is to have this huge stockpile of weapons because, hey, whether they have, presumably they do have contingency plans for if this war spreads and does become an out-and-out war between NATO and Russia. This is what Jens Stoltenberg said was his greatest fear for this winter, is that that would happen, sort of, between their designs and things going wrong. And as he said, if this goes wrong, this can go horribly wrong. And of course, we know he's referring to the danger of nuclear war, because, what are the chances of having a full-scale war between NATO and Russia and it not going nuclear? This is the incredible danger of this war. Now, the other unusual thing about this NDAA is that these contracts that they're putting out are multi-year contracts. These are not just weapons being ordered in 1 year. These contracts will be spread out over many years, and so they basically, to do this, they invoked wartime emergency procurement rules. So, I mean, in the irony that we're all very familiar with, that here we have a Congress whose power over making war is supposed to be the power to declare war. And of course, it hasn't declared war in any of our recent wars. And yet, when it comes to appropriating weapons and spending money, then we have, wartime emergency rules in place. And so I have a quote here from Julia Gledhill of Pogo. And basically, okay, well, I can't find that. But anyway, yeah, I mean, she, Pogo was just speaking out against, the awarding multi-year contracts. And I tried to ask her in advance of this call, just what are the implications of that? I mean, what happens if this war actually did come to a negotiated peace, and they've put in these contracts to build up these huge stockpiles of weapons over several years? What happens then? Well, what are the maybe Dan would know more about this, but I mean, what are the mechanisms then for saying, oh, well, oops, no, we don't need these weapons after all? Can Congress do that? Would it do it? Probably not. But anyway, so I don't know. I mean, we wrote that article in November. It all just sailed through Congress exactly as written. And and there was really no fuss. There was almost no reporting at the time as it sailed through. And so I thought that was something that all of you should know about. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. That was a lot of information and pretty sobering, but important stuff to know for sure. Okay, so now we have Dan Kovalik, who's actually visited Russia and the Donbass. And yeah, all over to you, Dan.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. Yes, I spent all of November in Russia, including a week in the Donbass, specifically in the Donetsk People's Republic, which I'll talk about. I just want to, before that, I get to that, briefly go over a couple major news stories that I think are relevant to all this, that you may or may not have seen. Of course, you saw about the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. It has to be noted that, Syria's ability to handle this earthquake, to do reconstruction from it, to provide humanitarian aid in the face of the earthquake are being hampered greatly by U.S. sanctions and by the fact that the U.S. still occupies 1/3 of Syria's territory. It happens to be the most oil-rich part of Syria. The U.S. is controlling about 80% of Syria's oil, which makes people are down to about 2 hours of electricity a day. And by the way, to rebuild these buildings, most of which are concrete, is very energy intensive. And so the fact that they don't have access to their own oil makes it nearly impossible to do reconstruction. I think that was just important to mention. The other big story from today, of course, is that Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, has come out and detailed what many of us suspected for a long time, and that is that the United States planned and carried out the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which, again, it did not take Lieutenant Frank Colombo to figure this out, but you should check out Seymour Hersh's article on Substack about that. This relates a lot to what Medea Benjamin was talking about in terms of environmental fallout from all this. That the destruction of Nord Stream was the greatest environmental terrorist act in human history. It created the greatest methane leak we've ever known. And methane is a contributor to global warming 20 times more than CO2 is. And so people who care about the environment should be appalled that the United States carried out that act of terrorism against the environment and, frankly, against its Western allies that have depended on that natural gas for years. You know, the Western Europe was rebuilt after World War II with the help of natural gas from the Soviet Union. They've been depending on natural gas from Russia for many decades, which a lot of people don't realize. Okay, that gets me to, in particular, the war in Ukraine. First of all, and many of you know this, but I need to repeat it for those who may not know it or who may have forgotten about it. This war has been going on since 2014. In 2014, the U.S. supported a coup d'etat against a democratically elected government. They put in power a right-wing government, which was oppositional, to say the least, towards its own Russian-speaking population, particularly in eastern Ukraine. President Poroshenko of Ukraine, that the U.S. backed, in fact, declared that the people, Russian-speaking people in the Donbass, would be living in cellars for the rest of their life because of what the government in Kiev planned to do to them. The government in Kiev outlawed the Russian language, and in response to that, and in response to the threats by the government in Kiev, the two republics in the Donbass, the Donetsk People's Republic that I visited and Luhansk, had referendums in which they, by large margins, voted to become autonomous from Ukraine. Meanwhile, so at that point, Kiev began attacking Ukraine, the Donbass, and thousands of people died in that conflict. 14,000 people died in that conflict between the government of Kiev and their own people in the Donbass before Russia intervened in February of last year. That has to be pointed out. And now what also has to be pointed out, and this is fairly recent news, so we know that there were two agreements, two Minsk agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II, which a number of countries signed on to, including Ukraine, which Germany was to be a guarantor of, and which the Security Council of the United Nations unanimously approved to bring peace to the conflict in Ukraine between the government in Kiev and the Donbass. And this agreement provided, the biggest part of it provided that all foreign troops were to leave the Donbass, including the troops from Kiev, that the government in Kiev was to stop shelling and attacking the Donbass, and that the people of the Donbass should receive a certain level of autonomy within a federal republic of Ukraine if that's what they wanted. Now, what is recent about all this is that the guarantor, one of the guarantors of the Minsk agreements, Angela Merkel, the chancellor, former chancellor of Germany, has admitted that the West never intended to abide by the Minsk agreements, that this was merely a ploy to allow Ukraine to arm itself. This sentiment or this position was also echoed by the former president of France, Hollande, who said the same thing, that the West never intended to abide by it. It was merely an attack to buy time, to rearm. And of course, Poroshenko himself, the former president of Ukraine, has said that. So there's no doubt that these peace agreements that were to bring peace to Ukraine, the West never intended to abide by them. Meanwhile, the weekend before Russia intervened in February of last year, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a 57-member organization, which includes the United States as part of that, a number of Western European countries are part of that organization. It is now headed by a German. So it's a very, well, at least ostensibly neutral organization, reported that there were 2,000 ceasefire violations between the government in Kiev and the Donbass the weekend before Russia intervened in Ukraine in February of last year. Meanwhile, as Russia claimed, tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops were lined up on the border of the Donbass, preparing to invade the Donbass before Russia intervened in February of 2022. This is what led Russia ultimately to decide to intervene when it did, for a couple of reasons. One, to prevent what would have been, no doubt, a genocide in the Donbass, but also because it feared that once the Ukrainian forces backed by NATO invaded the Donbass en masse, Russia would be fighting the Ukrainians within Russia's own borders. This has to be pointed out because while the Western press reported on the war in Ukraine, certainly not as much as it should have, it did report on it, at least sporadically, in the 8 years prior to Russia's intervention. But once Russia intervened, all of a sudden everyone pretended, oh, the war just begun. They forgot that it had been happening for the last 8 years. They also forgot that there were Nazis involved with the government and the military of Ukraine, even though that was reported on as well in the Western press prior to the Russian intervention. I mean, there were articles in The Nation talking about how right-wingers from, the U.S. were going to the Ukraine being trained by the neo-Nazis. In fact, I'll just remind people, if you don't know it, this was such a problem that at some point, the Democratic Congressman John Conyers sponsored and Congress passed and Obama signed a bill forbidding the U.S. to fund Nazis in Ukraine. Well, why would you need such a bill if there were no Nazis? And then to add to that, Congress then voted to repeal that prohibition, and Obama approved the repeal of the prohibition, therefore allowing the U.S. to arm Nazis in Ukraine. Why would you need to repeal this if there were no Nazis in Ukraine? Because, in fact, there were and are Nazis that have high positions in the Ukrainian government and military. That brings me to my trip to the Donbass, where people were very clear, people who lived there, people who've lived there for the last 8 years, who have armed themselves to defend themselves against the Ukrainian military and against neo-Nazis, that in fact those Nazis exist. I met people who were actually detained by the Azov, neo-Nazi Azov battalion. For one woman for 90 days, because she was reporting on Ukraine's human rights abuses. She even wrote a book about her captivity. I met another man who was detained for 4 years. I mean, these organizations existed and still exist, though less so now than they did. And again, you can find Western reports of this before February of 2022, but all of a sudden everyone had amnesia about it. In fact, interestingly, it was just celebrated the defeat of the Nazis at Stalingrad in the Soviet Union, which was a major turning point in World War II. And the people of the Donetsk People's Republic, Donetsk was known, by the way, as Stalino till 1961. And they have a saying, first Stalingrad and now Stalino. And what do they mean by this? That the Russians had turned back the Nazis at Stalingrad in 1943, and now the people of what was Stalino, what's now the Donetsk People's Republic, are going to turn back to fascists now. They are very clear that that's what they're fighting in the Donetsk People's Republic. And during the 8 years of the conflict that was going on, there were, again, neo-Nazi groups that occupied portions of the Donetsk People's Republic, that tortured people, raped people, killed women and children. And again, this was reported in human rights organizations. I was reporting on this in those 8 years. But again, all of that's been conveniently forgotten. And again, that one can draw their own conclusions from all this about, whether about their own view about Russia's own actions here. But the point is that the people of the Donbass have been under attack by this government in Ukraine for 8 years. It is not a democratic government. It is not a government that has abided by human rights. And to pretend otherwise is frankly a disservice to the people of the Donbass that, by the way, very few people speak for. And I'll just be honest, the people of the Donbass, certainly in the Donetsk People's Republic that I visited, are relieved that Russia is there. They wanted them there to protect them from the government in Ukraine. And that is something that people have to reckon with as a fact. And we'll see how things turn out. But I think a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia will have to deal with that. By the way, the other thing we have to point out is that, related to that, is that in March and April of last year, Russia and Ukraine actually had an agreement in principle on a peace deal. And the US and Great Britain intervened to get Zelensky not to sign that deal. That is why Boris Johnson had a emergency trip to Kiev in April to tell him not to sign that deal. This war could have been over by then. Of course, the war could have been avoided completely had the West agreed not to make Ukraine part of NATO, had agreed to get Ukraine to stop attacking the Donbass. But they never agreed to those things because honestly, they wanted this conflict. I'm very clear on that. They wanted it for the reasons Medea said, in order to find a way to wean Western Europe off Russian natural gas and instead to buy Western or United States natural gas and energy, and in order to engorge the US's own defense industry. And I also believe, as has been suggested, that there are at least segments of the leadership in Washington that would like a war directly with Russia, and we are creeping up to that. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have moved the nuclear clock to 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been. And if for no other reason, we have to unite to prevent a nuclear war, which I believe, again, there are people in Washington who are willing to wage. And you see in various Western press sources, including the New York Times, an attempt to really groom the US population for the possibility of a nuclear war. There was even a public service announcement in New York City about how to, what to do in case of nuclear war. And at the end, they said, "You got this, New York," right? As if anyone could get it, could deal with such an eventuality. And that's an eventuality, again, at a minimum, whatever you think of any of this, that should unite all of us to oppose. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. More sobering news. And thank you, Nicholas. And thank you, Medea. We are at an hour now. It's 9:01. We often say we do hour-long webinars, but in fact, they usually go over an hour. So this is the case where it is going over an hour if we're going to have Q&A. And I asked Dan and Nicholas if they were able to stay a little over an hour, and they both said yes. So why don't we have 15 minutes or so of Q&A? And the way we do it is, I see Bernard Gordon has already done it. You raise your hand in the reaction clicker down at the bottom or wherever it is on your screen. So your hand raises up. And what we'll do is take one after another of the hands that get raised up and see how far we get with 15 minutes. So just to remind you all, please, when you get to speak, we'll unmute you. You unmute yourself and, be brief in your comments, and please do have a question for Nicholas and Dan. Okay, Bernard, your turn to ask a question. Go right ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
Bernard, you should be getting a prompt that asks you to unmute.
Okay, this is kind of out of the scope of this today's webinar, but as you know, there's tensions between mainland China and Taiwan that have long histories behind it, just like Ukraine and Russia have long histories. Nothing is born out of a vacuum. And but my question is, do you see any hope in religious groups like Pax Christi and the church, many churches, trying to organize some of their parishioners or parish members against these wars? And I guess let me just leave it at that.
Well,
Yeah,
go ahead.
this Christmas, Peace in Ukraine, Code Pink, and a number of other groups, I think maybe Massachusetts Peace Action was involved in that, reached out to faith groups. And we ended up getting, it was over 1,000 faith, local faith groups and, just groups of all different denominations signing on to call for a Christmas truce in Ukraine. And so, and that was quite powerful. And there's some follow-up going on with that. Some of these groups are involved in things like the National Prayer Breakfast, that, they have better access to the high-ups in Washington than we do. Even, some of them get invited to the White House and things like that. So there's definitely some action happening there, and definitely room for more, for sure.
I just want to say also that the Pope has been pretty good on this, Pope Francis, and the Vatican has offered to host peace talks if the parties wanted that. So yeah, I think the church, various churches, could play a very meaningful role in all this.
Good. Thank you. And Steve, looks like Kravitsky.
Yes, thank you, Ken. Yeah, greetings from the Connecticut Peace and Solidarity Coalition. And I think that what we're seeing in the chat reflects a need for unity in this movement. As many of us go back to the Vietnam era, where it took a long time to build such a powerful movement that is one of the reasons why, we defeated imperialism in Vietnam. And I think seeing what people are saying in the chat, and I'd like the speakers to comment on this. Why are there two different demonstrations called for the weekend of February 18th and 19th? This has happened far too often. And if people are going to make the trip down there, I live in Connecticut, and some of you, I recognize a friend of mine, Steve Watrous from Milwaukee. We go back a long way. We need unity in action. I know there's political differences, but if we're going to be effective, there's also these groups who need to get out of their silos. Why isn't the climate movement involved? All the other different movements that are out there. If we're going to have an impact, and to me, it comes down, in all honesty, to defeating capitalism, then all these groups have to come together if we're going to make an impact in the long run. And we know what we're up against, but there's some hope in what we're doing here, and having Vets for Peace involved and all that with the Golden Rule boat tour. So I'm wondering if the speakers could comment on, what do we need to do beyond what a lot of us think about building a movement for the long run that could really make a difference. Thank you.
Well, my own view is that I agree with you that we need unity, and that, I would urge people to go to any protest that calls for an end to militarization of at all, to an end to NATO, to an end of military support for Ukraine. And it is disappointing to see splits. I would just urge people to go to all the protests.
Is not doing what they're supposed to do. Okay, don't allow them to come. That's fine. But
Somebody needs to be muted, it sounds like.
So, I think there's just political disagreements. From what I understand, in February, libertarians, more conservative libertarians, are organizing one of the protests, and I didn't even know there was a second protest that same day. But again, whether you agree with those people or not, I think it's important to go to it. Then I know in mid-March, there's going to be Answer Coalition, and some other groups are supporting a march as well in Washington. And again, I would support both. I think we need to overlook some of our political disagreements and support peace. That's my own view.
I don't have much to add. I just agree with what you both have said, but it is absolutely vital. And we wrote this book really to try and give people the background that they're not getting from in mainstream media or the politicians, and just so we try and we need to educate each other and have a basis to really come together and feel the urgency, because there are polls that show that in many countries, even including the US, some of them, half or more than half of the respondents will say that they support a negotiated end to this war. And yet, when you ask people the sort of more general questions about, what issues they're concerned about in the country and that sort of thing, it's still it doesn't raise up to the level of the sort of top 10 concerns of most Americans. So most people, I think, understand we need peace in Ukraine. An awful lot of people do. They understand that, but so it is going to take a movement to educate people, to help people to understand why this should be important to them, and then to really come together with these demonstrations and other actions across all these other lines that may separate people.
Okay, good. Thank you both. Okay, I see 6 hands raised, and maybe we should call it quits after those 6 get to ask their questions, make their comments. I wonder if we can take 2 at a time. We'll take Jeff and Pascal, I'll say your name is Pascal, and you both speak and ask your question, and then after you speak, then both our presenters will respond to both of you.
Hi, Jeff Rudisil here. Thank you for your presentations. I come here looking for peace in Ukraine, and what I hear is history. Okay, good history, stuff I already know. Where's the action? What are you asking for us to do? The long-winded answers, I agree with Steve's long-winded question about reflecting the impact of our capitalist system on this whole issue, and would like to state that what we need to focus on is life over money. Think about that. Life over money. Instead of people versus profits, it's life over money. If you put things in those contexts, people can understand it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
And hello, this is Pascal Lota from Tokyo. Greetings to everybody. Thank you very much for a wonderful panel. From the very left, Noam Chomsky, to the very right, Henry Kissinger. To Henry Kissinger, everybody agreed that Ukraine is a model case for a neutral state and a neutral solution has to emerge. And the Russians were all but begging for a neutral solution in order to avoid the war. Why did that fail in the United States? Why did the other side win over of how to push Ukraine? And secondly, do you both still see a neutral, so a non-NATO member Ukraine as part of the solution in order to bring peace? And maybe thirdly, the non-aligned movement outside of the United States is gathering steam. Do you see a way of collaborating with them? Thank you.
Yeah, we just heard from the former Israeli prime minister who mediated those negotiations in March. And he's now come out and said exactly what Turkish diplomats involved have said, and what advisors to Zelensky told Ukrainska Pravda back in May. And I mean, we have a clear, consistent understanding of what happened there. And basically, Russia was ready to withdraw in exchange for Ukraine becoming a neutral country, and Ukraine agreed to that. And so, I mean, that would be the best possible outcome, really, for Ukraine for Ukraine to be neutral, and even to be, who knows, eventually a bridge between East and West. Of course, then you have Donbass and you have Crimea, and I mean, those people deserve self-determination as much as anyone else in Ukraine does. And I think it's interesting, when we were working on the book, I discovered, which I hadn't known before, that there was a Gallup poll in Ukraine 2 months after the coup in 2014, in which people were asked, do you consider the new government of Ukraine to be the legitimate government of Ukraine? They weren't asked whether they supported it, just is it your legitimate government? And only 51% said yes. So, I mean, Ukraine while Ukrainians appear more united now in defense of their country, at that point, what the United States did and what the right-wing forces in Ukraine did with that coup, that violent overthrow of the government, were really, split the country in half. And this was just for the US to meddle in Ukraine the way it did, and was warned so many times, that it would lead to war, or it would lead to conflict, or lead to civil war in Ukraine, and really right the way through, but then including in April, when the UK, where I come from, and the US undermined that peace agreement, stopped it, as Bennett said, they stopped it or they blocked it. And, so that really puts a lot of the responsibility for the continuing bloodshed on the US and UK as well as on Russia.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add, except that I agree that Ukraine should be a neutral country. I think that's what originally the Ukrainian people wanted. The elected government in place in 2014, before the coup, that of Yanukovych, he was trying to take a very careful path between Russia and Europe. And the US didn't want that. They wanted him to be in the Western camp. Meanwhile, Zelensky himself in 2019 was voted into power on a peace platform, that he would make peace with Russia. So I think the Ukrainian people have wanted Ukraine to be neutral. They didn't want this balance to be torn asunder. I think the US, though, did not want peace in Ukraine. They wanted this war for the reasons I said. One, to get Western Europe off of natural gas from Russia. Two, of course, to line the pockets of the defense industry. And third, to dismantle Russia. I mean, that's been a goal as well. And that was mentioned, for example, in a 2019 RAND Corporation document that said that, Ukraine could be used to undermine Russia. And by the way, it goes back to Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard from 1997, where he talked about using Ukraine to undermine Russia. By the way, everyone I met with in Donetsk knew that book, The Grand Chessboard by Brzezinski. They're very aware that Ukraine is being used as a pawn by the West in a war against Russia. And that's what this is. And that's how Russia sees it as well. So I agree with what you're saying.
Okay, we have, let's see, 4 more people. Let's take 2 at a time, Colleen and Bill. Go ahead, Colleen. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was wondering what you think, whether Biden is going to send fighter jets. Apparently, after they got the tanks, Zelensky immediately asked for fighter jets, and the UK Prime Minister has somehow hinted that they would be sending fighter jets. So I wonder if the Speaker thinks that's the next step, is the US, NATO are going to send fighter jets.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Let's take Bill next, if that's okay, Dan, and then
Okay.
answer them both.
Okay. Yeah. No, I just had I had a really quick question from a friend of mine I've been debating. I'm kind of more on Nicholas's side and Dan's side, but my friend is convinced that Putin is a thuggish autocrat who is looking to recreate the Soviet Union, or at the very least, Tsarist Russia, and that the U.S. is doing the right thing. We should send tanks. We should send F-16s. We should send anything that Ukraine wants because Putin must be stopped. Now, my friend is a political scientist. He's convinced of his position. How do you argue with someone who says that this is all Putin's fault and that really the smart choice is to fight this war?
Well, when I get that question at book events I've done, the first thing I do is to take this back to the 1990s and NATO expansion. And I quote people like George Kennan and William Burns, great CIA director, who back then was working at the embassy in Moscow. And and just these warnings. People wrote 50 experts wrote a letter to Clinton calling NATO expansion what did they say? A policy error of historic proportions. I mean, Kennan was so explicit. He said, he said, this is a betrayal of the very people who have just conducted the greatest non-violent revolution in history, the Russian people. And and he, as far as I know, is the first person who this is in 1998, coined the term a new Cold War. And then I point out to people that, well, had any of us at that point heard of Vladimir Putin? No. So the US government has been warned that this was where it was headed before we ever heard of Vladimir Putin. So, people need to look at those warnings, the promises made not to expand NATO, which there's a very good web collection at the National Security Archive called What Gorbachev Heard, with all those promises that have all been broken, of course. So that seems like a good place to start in trying to sort of debunk the it's all about Putin idea.
Yeah, I agree. And also, you have to remember also Putin helped with the war on terror. He was the first world leader to call George W. Bush after 9/11, to offer condolences, to offer help in the war on terror. I think Putin has wanted to be friends with the West. I honestly think it's the West that has not wanted to be friends with him, and in terms of him allegedly wanting to expand the Russian Empire, whatnot, he could have invaded the Donbass and taken it 8 years ago. And there are people in Russia who wanted him to, including the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. I think he held off because he did not want to do it. I think he ended up doing it because in the end, he and his national security team thought that they had to do it. That's my own view. But also, this idea that the U.S. is responsible for every move of every country around the world. The U.S. is now poised to invade Haiti. Biden has said that he's going to say, do you think in the Kremlin they're debating whether they have to send tanks to Haiti to confront that? I don't think so. The world doesn't look at, does not view the world the way we do, right? That they have to control every contingency. And so the whole premise of what your friend is saying, I just reject. But in any case, I don't view Putin the way he does. I agree with people like, well, I'm blanking out on his name, Stephen F. Cohen, the late Stephen F. Cohen, who also didn't view him that way. I think we could have prevented this very easily, this conflict, and I think the U.S. wanted it. That's what I believe. Oh, and in terms of the fighter jets, I think it's very likely that Biden will send them. You know, you see this constant thing Biden does. He'll say, we're never going to do that. We're never going to send tanks. And then he sends tanks. We're never going to send this. And then he sends them. I mean, I think there's very few limits here unless the American peace movement stops it, is the answer, I think. Yeah.
And another answer to that question is that Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, also told Ukraine today or yesterday, whenever it was, that Britain will start training pilots on British fighter jets. In other words, they're preparing. In other words, so that if, a few months from now, they're going to give them fighter jets, A, they'll be the British ones because they know how to fly them. And B, they'll be ready to fly them. And, whereas with the tanks, there's now a period where they've all got to learn how to use these tanks. Likewise, the Patriot missiles that normally take over a year to train on. So I don't think they're training people to fly these planes and then are not going to give them the planes.
Okay, we're going much longer than we usually do. Thank you all for sticking with us here, and thank you, Dan and Nicholas, for hanging out here with us. Let's take two more questions and call it a night. So we got Elizabeth and Jerry.
Okay. I'll be first, I guess. That most people don't think about this, but I have noticed a lot of isms floating around in the conversation. And whereas I deeply believe that economics is under all of it, I do think that whatever ism it is that is an economic ism is toxic because then it is used as a form of government and not a form of economy. If it is used in a small group that agrees to that kind of economy, any of these economic isms, whether it's capitalism or socialism or communism or whatever ism you figure out, works. It works within the context of a group of people who agree to it. And by definition, that can't be a huge nation with a top-down government. But if you use that as a form of government and say, I have a communist form of government or a capitalist form of government, then you end up mandating things that don't work at all and benefit only a few people.
I have a question, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think we need to differentiate between the ism that is truly economic and works among the groups that agree to it, and the ism that is economic but is applied like a form of government. I think that makes a big difference wherever you go. On the one hand, you're delving into politics. On the other hand, you're talking with a group of people that can talk about it. Capitalism is toxic. Socialism is toxic. Communism is toxic when used as a form of government for a large group. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you. Jerry.
Yes, I will say something about what Elizabeth was saying. I've wondered what would make our leaders gamble on a nuclear war and keep escalating this to the degree they have and probably will in the future. And maybe there is an economic thing. We all know that Kissinger negotiated the petrodollar back at the end of Vietnam when we couldn't pay back the debt we had run up. And the petrodollar has been kept afloat. And now we're $32 trillion in debt, which everybody knows we'll never pay back. But still, the dollar is still world's reserve currency. So Putin has oil, Russia has oil, they have natural gas. Of course, now pipelines been blown up, so it's not accessible or to be sold. But anyway, we've gone after, I've noticed all the countries that have petroleum reserves, Venezuela, and Iraq, and so on. So is this fear of the collapse of the petrodollar fueling some of these, especially the conflict with Russia and maybe other conflicts we've got in the fear of the collapse of the dollar? How much of that is a factor into what we see going on? That's my question.
Well, I think, oh, go ahead. I think absolutely. I mean, not just the collapse of the dollar. I think this is about, people are talking about Putin as an imperialist. I think this is about the U.S. fearful it's losing its hegemony. And that's why it's threatening war, not just with Russia, but with China as well. I think the U.S. is an empire in decline, and it is desperately trying to cling to its domination and is willing, or at least there are some leaders in Washington, though I think there's debates between different factions, but there are some who are willing to use nuclear weapons to maintain U.S. dominance. You look at what the U.S. has done. I mean, again, what just blows my mind, when Biden said, oh, this is the first war in Europe since World War II. What about the NATO bombing of Serbia for 78 days, right? Oh, countries don't invade other countries. The U.S. invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, right? And Libya. I mean, it's the U.S. that is the most aggressive country in the world. Jimmy Carter said that we're the right, that we are the greatest, war-making country in world history. Martin Luther King said that when he said the U.S. is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. We're the empire trying to cling to our last vestiges of empire, and there's desperate people who are willing to use desperate means to do that. And that's what we have to oppose.
Well, I grew up in the last outposts of a dying empire, the British Empire. I was born in Sri Lanka. I lived in Hong Kong, Gibraltar, Malta, all over England and Scotland, but literally none of the bases where I grew up is still a British military base. So this is what happens. Paul Kennedy wrote a good book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And, he talked about how once a country has built an economic empire, there is this tendency it ends up also becoming a military empire. This is a fairly consistent pattern of this. And but then as its economic power shrinks, as the economic tides move on, and it's no longer the dominant economic one, as Britain was no longer economically dominant by 100 years ago, and yet it still went through 2 world wars before it finally started to pull back and grant independence to its colonies. And the United States is trying to do something impossible. The project for a new American century was a nightmarish vision, frankly. That it could use that because it no longer had this peer competitor in the Soviet Union. We all wanted a peace dividend, but instead the people in Washington wanted a power dividend. They wanted to take advantage of that situation. They thought, now there's no constraint on a use of military power, and just look what it has done 20, 30 years later, spread chaos and violence to country after country after country. And Medea and I calculated, and we mentioned this in the book, that the US in the past 20 years dropped, what is it? It's more than 300,000 bombs and missiles on other countries. It works out to something like 46 bombs and missiles dropped every day for 20 years. That is what the United States has been doing around the world. And as you say, Biden has the goal to stand up there and sort of say, no one has ever done anything like this before, talking about Russia. And it's astonishing. But again, this is why, we all need to talk to people, and people need to be educated, and people need to understand the reality. We're living in the world that William Casey foretold in Ronald Reagan's first cabinet meeting, when he said the CIA will know that its disinformation campaign is successful when absolutely nothing that the American people believe is actually true. And we have been, that's the world that our leaders have been steering us into. And the level of ignorance, just of lack of education. I mean, and no ignorance about our own history, and ignorance of anything that's going on in the world beyond, the little sort of debates between talking heads on CNN. I mean, that's the news now. That when you talk about news, people think that's the news. I mean, it's absolutely insane. I mean, all the major news gathering organizations have laid off sort of 90% of their news gatherers. And it's so this is what we're up against. And it will take all of our efforts to try and restore. I mean, democracy dies in darkness. Bill wrote a column about this a couple of days ago. Just comparing the Republican congressman who just completely made up his whole CV to what the military does, and this is what they do. And somehow we all have to, educate each other and keep learning and come together to change this situation. Eisenhower said a knowledgeable citizenry, but what we have got is the exact opposite.
Well, that's a good place to end, I think. Well, this has been a truth-telling hour and a half. I sure appreciate all three presenters, but this Q&A, Nicholas and Dan, has been very powerful. I really appreciate what you have to say, and I'm sure everybody else does too. And thank you all for sticking with us. We had almost 300 people on this webinar. We're down now, but a lot of people came on to hear, because this topic is just the topic of our times right now. We are looking at disaster, aren't we? And speaking of which, let me remind you that we have a workshop coming up for WERN on, it's called the Watchdog Workshop, on checking out the subsidies that your local war industry get. But then in March, we have a webinar on nuclear weapons. So that's right to the point of this evening as well. So thank you all. Thank you, Dan, Nicholas. Thank you, Medea and Absentia on your airplane. And, peace, everyone.
Peace. Thank you.
Let's keep at it.